because Xi has purged the system so thoroughly of anyone who is even theoretically competent in order to prevent anyone from rising up from below to potentially challenge him or replace him. And in doing so, he is so terrified the bureaucracy at this point that no one will bring him information at all. As a result, the system's breaking down, and their ability to collect data, much less process it and publish it, has basically stopped. Now, some of these things are ego-driven. So, for example, the Chinese just stopped collecting information on COVID because they didn't want everyone to know how many people died when they did their opening. We just don't know. We don't even have an educated guess, honestly. But some of this stuff really matters. Youth unemployment. We don't know what the status of the next generation is. Patents, which supposedly you need for an information-based society. The information is no longer collected. Bond purchases. How the hell do you have a bond market if you don't know what's on offer and who is buying what? That was supposedly how they were going to get away from an investment-led system, to have a different debt market. Well, that's gone. But the ones that scare me the most are more personal. Political biographies, college dissertations. Because that's how young people get a foot in the system and move up. And Xi's made sure that they can't, so they can never challenge him. So it's just him. Now, my biggest criticism of Barack Obama is he believed he was the smartest person in the room, and he would tell people that. His first meeting with the Joint Chiefs, you got all the 3 and the 4 stars in the room. He said, I'm smarter than all of you. I can do your jobs better than all of you. Let's assume for the moment that Barack Obama was correct. So, you're going to do everyone's jobs here and your own. No. Xi has done that for the entire country. Decisions cannot be made without him. The reason he didn't show up to the G20 summit wasn't because he was mad at the Indians, although he was. It's because he had to do it home, because he's the only one who can make decisions. And I think the best way to kind of explain how this is leading to a state collapse is that stupid balloon. Now, I'm not a balloon expert. That's just not in my field. And neither is the American president. But we had pretty much the same response when the thing crossed over from Canada. I'm sure Canada's at fault for this somehow. It was like, shoot the thing down, let's see what we're dealing with. I mean, the balloon was 350 feet across, was dangling something the size of an Embraer jet, was like 14 times the size of the plane that I flew on here yesterday, which, is tiny unless it's dangling from a balloon. So, I mean, it's obviously it was a spy platform. So let's shoot it down and see what we got. The DOD and the CIA, secretary and director, went to President Biden, like, Mr. President, please don't shoot this thing down. I mean, we're not threatened. We really are not concerned about this. We know where it's going. It's going to float over the missile silos in Montana. But Mr. President, unless you're planning on firing a few dozen nukes in the next few days, those hatches are going to be closed. They're always closed, Mr. President. The Chinese will get photos of closed hatches from 7 miles away. We are not scared about this. But Mr. President, there's an opportunity here. Because if you let this thing go on its merry way, we'll put a spy helicopter below it, and a spy plane above it, and every whisper sensor we have, and we will track over the next 9 days. And we'll copy all their cryptography. We'll trace the signals through the civilian information exchange network. We'll see which satellites they're using. And we will trace it back, not to the city, not to the block, not to the building, not to the floor, not to the office, to the terminal that is doing the controls. And Mr. President, we have the best hackers in the world. We will hack that of a terminal. We will find out who is on it, and then we will trace them using signals intelligence and map out their whole world. Mr. President, the Chinese have handed us the intelligence breakthrough of the decade. All you have to do is let the thing float. And then when it gets over North Carolina, we'll shoot it down and we'll get the hardware too, which we did. We now know that Xi was unaware of the balloon's existence until after it was shot down. He's that much in the dark. No one would tell him. We now know that their Ministry of Defense was unaware of it until it crossed into American airspace. It was just some in the intelligence bureau who thought this is what Wolf warrior diplomacy means. This is how you stick it to the Americans. We're seeing breakdowns like this at every government level, in every economic sector. The capacity of the Chinese to make decisions, to flow information, has stopped. This was the dumbest thing I have seen any country do in the last 20 years. And if you think back on the last 2 decades, there has been so much dumb. This is what state failure looks like in the early stages. So yes, China, 10 years tops, but it can end so much faster. Let's talk credit. This is the American private credit curve. From the beginning in 2000 to that bump in the middle, that's the subprime build. We doubled total private credit in 7 years. It was too much. It was too fast. And we had a recession that knocked 5% off of headline GDP because of it. Since then, we've picked up the growth, but at something a lot more similar to the century average. Doesn't mean I think we have no concerns in the space. This is just to give us a benchmark. Doubling, 7 years, 5% recession. Got it? Same data, different scale. Here are the Canadians. Now, you'll notice in the early part of the stage, they were doing something similar to us, but a little bit lower. In fact, up until 2007, the Canadians, I would argue, had the healthiest banking sector in the world. Good risk management. And then we had the Great Recession. And the Canadians did something that was very Canadian. Like, Americans just had the worst recession ever. We can totally have a worse recession. And they dismantled all of the risk management they had put into place over the last 30 years, doubled down on every mistake that we made, and their credit swelled, and it contributed to the housing crisis they're having now. Then they got to about 2014, and like, maybe we don't want to win this one. And they dialed it back. I'd say they're not out of the woods yet, but it looks better now than it did a decade ago. Here are the Germans. If you're in Germany and you want to buy a house, you don't get your 20% together and go to the bank for the other 80. You tell the bank that you want to buy a house, and they're like, great. So what you need to do is figure out what your mortgage would be if we gave you the loan and deposit that with us on the first of the month. And then again the next month, and then the next month, and the next month for 60 months. Then we will talk about your loan application. You have to prove that you're not a credit risk for 5 years first. There are problems in the German system. A credit overbuild is not one of them. But it is in Greece. 7-fold increase of credit in 7 years. So far, their economic adjustments down has knocked 60% off of GDP. They, I would have said 3 years ago, had another 20% to go, but then COVID happened and all the numbers. Here is Australia. Now, one of the fun things about the United States during subprime is at the height of the crisis in August of 2007, the FDIC chair, the Treasury Secretary, and the Federal Reserve Chair all crowded around a two-top in a bar in Washington, and over the course of about a 45-minute conversation, worked out the bare bones of what eventually became TARP, which was our restitution program for subprime. And that was the model that we followed until the end of the crisis. And it said, in very American terms, that if you f***ed up, you lose. So whether you were the lender or the lendee, there were losses taken. The government money was only there for people to reconstitute. And if you made a mistake, you didn't get everything back. It was something to stabilize the financial sector, not bail out individuals or corporations. And broadly speaking, it worked. Now, the Australians did something very similar when they set up their restitution program, but they didn't call anyone to account. Every mortgage was backed at 100%. Furthermore, they changed the laws. So if you could prove that you could pay your mortgage with a 100% government guarantee, you automatically qualified for a second mortgage, and a third, and a fourth. They haven't had their adjustment yet. And when they do, oh my God.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
The information vacuum in China now, it's impossible to know whether or not there's going to be an attack because Xi doesn't talk with anyone. There's no one's phone you can bug to find out what he's thinking. Also, if the Chinese were to make a move on Taiwan, even if they capture it in a matter of 6 weeks without a shot fired, they don't know how to operate those semiconductor facilities because they can't operate their own. They use imported labor to do all of the quality checks on all of the wafers. And the ones in Taiwan are the world's most advanced. The ones in China are very much the other side. So if they got them, they would just be big paperweights, and obviously that would remove semiconductors for the rest of us, but it wouldn't really help them technologically. And it would trigger, among other things, the United States to act militarily. And it's not like we would confront the Chinese in the South China Sea or anything. We'd probably just put a couple destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy flow and cut the ability of them to import the things they need to grow their own food. So China would be facing a national collapse within a couple of years if they do pull the trigger on Taiwan. Normally, I would say that this would mean that they wouldn't even consider it. But again, Xi is now in an information black box, and we can't rule it out. All I can tell you for sure is that one way or another, some country involved in the supply chain somewhere is going to crack. I'm actually more concerned about Germany than I am about Taiwan, but it would have the same impact. The Germans specifically make the lenses that allow all of the lithography to happen. No lenses, no lithography, no chips. The hope, because people seem to like me to say things that are hopeful, is that there is a new lithography technology that is coming out that has fewer parts and doesn't require neon, which we're dependent on the Russians and the Chinese for, that might have a simpler supply chain. But if we ironed out all the kinks of that today, it's not going to be applied at scale in Taiwan within 3 years. So there are potentially ways forward here, but I find it unlikely that we're going to be able to avoid a disruption in that specific market. It's too vulnerable to too many things. All world leaders, democratic or otherwise, have problems with narcissism and ego. We're not immune to that. The question is how honest you are about your own capacity. So Putin has also established a bit of a cult of personality and has also purged the system of people who might rise up to replace him. But he started from a much lower base, which has shaped how much he's willing to carve out. So at the end of the Cold War, let me go back, 1983, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And the intelligence services took over, purged all the other factions from the Communist Party. This is the Andropov coup. And Andropov, Chernomyrdin, and Gorbachev, they were the first three, ran the country until the end. Putin is part of that clique, and the intelligence professionals took over after the fall and have run it until now. And Putin has bit by bit removed people who he thought was threatening, and he hasn't done a lot to bring up a new generation from below. So Putin's inner circle today is less than 10 people, half of whom are utterly incompetent. If you ever see anything by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, he's the most incompetent of them. You can ignore whatever he says. But there are a few of them that actually do provide him with advice and context. So I think the best example I can give you is if you go back to the January before the war, the March, and the March, just after the war began, when Putin was making all the nuclear threats, the U.S. ambassador was dispatched, and the message was something like this, like, Mr. President, just think of things from a little different angle here. You remember back in January when you decided and you gave the order for the day the war was going to start, and you were in the bunker under the Kremlin that was completely sealed. It was walk-in safe, no electronics, no notes. And an hour after you left that meeting, we published the notes of the meeting in the media. That was our way of telling you that we know where your person is at any given moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen we send back are going to go anywhere except straight up, you're out of your mind. So stop it. The point is that Putin has meetings. He has people, he's discussed things, which means you can hack into the fax system and the email, you can tap the phones, there's ways to learn. And as bad as the demographic situation is in Russia, they're still a massive producer and exporter of food and energy, whereas China now has no inner circle, no communication, no way to find out anything, and are the world's largest importer of pretty much everything that keeps people alive. So in the worst case scenario for the Russians, they will still persist longer than in the best case scenario for the Chinese. China's almost over. The Russians have at least another decade and a half to 2 decades. But this is still probably the last generation of Russian leadership. And forced labor is going to be some of our least of our concerns when it comes to human rights issues. So I would expect those supply chains to wither for independent reasons. Second, business community swing voters. One of the things that people missed about Governor DeSantis of Florida is that he hasn't gone to war with Disney. He's gone to war with the Florida business community. ESG, is it doing a good job? Questionable. Is it taking us to where we need to go? I don't know. But since the business community is no longer part of the conversation, they are trying to figure out where they fit into American society. ESG is a component of that. It's an internal conversation. And so every business is approaching this from their own way, based on their own circumstances, their own geography, their own politics, their own workforce. And of course, they're all coming up with different conclusions, some of which are, But when people on the left or the right yell at business about ESG, business just gets pissed off because they're doing the best they can when they're not allowed in the room. So when I hear people like Ramaswamy or DeSantis screaming about ESG, it's like all you are doing is making it easier for the business community to never support the Republican Party again. So there are consequences, and we're going to see them in the presidential and the general election next year, but they're going to be unpredictable in a way that we're not used to seeing out of that community. We're used to the business community being the adults in the room. Now, more specifically to your question about child labor, since there are no standards in ESG, since every company comes at it from their own angle for their own reasons, there is no pattern, in my opinion. So we're going to be waiting to see what happens in terms of international capacity to build this stuff. And those countries are not going to snap in neat order or all at once. So I hate to say this, this is a tier 3 supplier issue. And there is not going to be a database that allows us to map this on its way down. Americans are very good at brain work. We have the highest value-added designers in the world. The Mexicans are great at production. They're the highest value-added manufacturers in the world. But if you were to increase the cost of labor in Mexico by a factor of 5, they'd probably give us a run for our money. It's not an issue of us or them being smarter or dumber than the other one. They're at a different stage of their economic cycles and their growth, and we have different infrastructures to work with. So I've never seen a study that looks at race from an IQ point of view that has ever held up. Every time I've ever seen it, they've kind of thrown it out. It's at best noise, but that doesn't mean we're all in the same place. So one of the things about January 6th is it happened just after an election, so its effects haven't been fully felt in terms of who votes for who. But when we got to the midterms, despite expecting a red wave, we had a red burp in the House and a red loss in the Senate. And what we found out is that the independents in the United States had changed considerably. A couple things. Number one, Trump has basically told independents that the general election doesn't matter, which means that the independents don't matter, and because the general election is the only place the independents have a voice. And so they reacted to that. In exit polling, something crazy, like 85% of independents said that they despised the White House's economic policies and felt that they hurt independents more than anyone else. And independents are fickle. They almost always switch sides every election. They get buyer's remorse. And in the time before, they had voted for Biden. And now they were clearly fed up with him, but almost all of them voted for Democrats anyway. There's a saying in the State Department in the Middle East that we support one person, one vote, but not just one time. And if the independents were going to show up in numbers to vote against their own personal economic best interests in order to make sure they could vote again in an off year, you can bet they're going to do so in the general. Trump will probably carry no more than 12 states. And then the Republican Party is going to have to decide what to do with that. And the people who are, oh no, I broke it. The people who are here, the rhinos, are going to have to decide if they want to try to wait it out, which hasn't worked yet, or move on. And we'll know within 2 years.
Every country is going to have to come up with their own solution. Every country basically has three paths to choose from. Number one, you kind of glom on to a country where this isn't a big deal. So in the case of Mexico, you obviously partner with the United States. The Japanese, for example, have decided that that's the way to go. And they cut a deal with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The Japanese are the only country to pull that off so far, and they are now part of the inner circle of the American strategic network. Second, you can find a way to go it alone. Maybe you don't need the allies. Maybe what you need is close and you can do kind of a neo-imperial system. I can see the French doing this. I can see the Turks doing this. Option three is you just figure out how to go without. Well, by the time we got past 1983 and the last real nuclear scare with the Soviets, relationships were steadily warming until the Cold War ended, in which case Russia was at least temporarily invited into the family of nations. So the structure of globalization was able to spread to the entire population of the world. At the same time, we were in this hanging moment demographically, where we knew that birth rates had been dropping for decades. And that meant in a lot of the advanced world, we were rapidly running out of children. But we still had all kinds of adults that had not yet aged into retirement. So we had this massive block of workers and consumers that were driving every part of the economy that we would ever want to be driven. It wasn't sustainable because there were no children. But for about 35 years, we were in this glorious moment where all things were possible, where there's plenty of finance, where there were no security risks, and where anyone who wanted to play a part in the international trading system could, and it was backed up by just these massive waves of workers and consumers. It was perfect. It was temporary. The truth isn't quite that simplistic. I mean, I understand the position. The moving around and the spreading around is certainly the issue. So globalization encouraged every country who wanted to play, even if these were countries that could never have been economically successful on their own in a pre-globalized system. So as a rule, and again, oversimplification, if the British Empire thought you were worth conquering, you probably couldn't make a go of it on your own. And so you had all these countries that had been colonies that all of a sudden under the American-led globalization model could play and didn't have to worry about their security. And in that sort of environment, the countries with good geographies, your United States, your France's, your Britain's, faced competition from a quarter that they never had before. And since they didn't have to worry about security costs, all of a sudden they were the low-cost producer for a lot of manufactured goods. And so we saw an industrial hollowing out of the advanced economies writ large, going to some of the secondary ones that have had a really hard time of it before. I might add this includes Germany. In that sort of environment, whether or not the wealth was distributed was a political decision to be made by the countries on the receiving end of that. So in the case of Korea or Germany, we got relatively egalitarian societies. In the case of Indonesia and India, not so much. And so I'm cautioning you against conflating the overall globalized trends and then decisions that were made at the local level. There are interrelationships, but it's definitely not causal. Well, let's look back at the Chinese history for a second. Here the Han ethnicity has been around for 3,500 years. But despite all that history, the Han Chinese have only been in charge of the bulk of the Chinese population for about 300 years. This is a place with a horrible geography, incredibly water poor in some parts, very rugged in others. And that means they've never been able to pull it together themselves. All of the Chinese empires of old, very few of them lasted more at their peak when we see all those maps in our books. In many cases, those maps only lasted for a few years, sometimes only for a few weeks before it all went to hell. And that's before you consider rampaging outsiders coming and wrecking the whole thing. So you only have about 300 years of unified Chinese history. Half of that is under the Mongols. Half of the rest is since 1945, when the Americans sent the Europeans and the Japanese home. So this myth that China has always been the biggest component of humanity is just that, a myth. And it was only with the globalized system in 1945 that the Chinese finally didn't face an external oppressor and could get around to the busy work of consolidating their own country under Mao. Fast forward to the Nixon-Mao summit of the 70s, and in order to turn the Chinese against the Russians, the Chinese were invited into the globalized order by the Americans. And that created the China that we know, a China with no security threats, a China with access to a world full of raw materials and markets. So this is an artificial construct carried out under an artificial environment in the most atypical period in human history. So of course they did well. But you break any part of that. You remove the Americans from the equation and globalization breaks. You look at their demographics and play it forward and you see that they don't have a workforce. And this goes away. So China, just like the world writ large, has enjoyed the best 35 years of its history, and it's over. I don't know if I'd quite use that word because that assumes the steady state system, and it's the system itself that is cracking apart. When we go into a more regional or even national economic model, the global whole that we've become used to these last 45 years, that is what breaks up. That is what is in danger. And there are parts of the world that were not able to expand their populations until they could import food, thinking primarily about the Middle East here. And there are portions of the world that were not able to get into manufacturers trade until the security environment changed, thinking primarily East Asia with this. And then there are parts of the world that have had to go to war for energy in the past but haven't recently. Now I'm thinking about Europe. If we remove those inputs that come from a different continent, we've got to find a way to do it either closer to home or we have to venture out to get it ourselves. Now, in the case of my country, we're the world's largest producer of energy, world's largest producer of food. We're the second largest manufacturing partner. Power, you throw in Mexico and Canada, and we're very close to Canada or to the Chinese already. This is a bumps in the road sort of scenario. Now, we're American. We're going to panic about the bumps in the road. That's just how we are. But if you look at other portions of the world, the degree of dislocation that is now being forced upon them is becoming very real very fast. To use an example in your backyard, we had the Nord Stream pipeline shut down last week. That is the number one venue transit point for getting Russian natural gas into Germany. The German economy isn't like the British or the American economy. We're a little bit more lackadaisical about our supply chains, and that allows us to diversify. The Germans keep it all in-house. So yes, some of that natural gas is used for electricity, but most goes into chemicals and petrochem. That forms the basis of German heavy industry. Those inputs are not exported. Those inputs are then used in medium and light industry in Germany. So they just lost the base material that allows modern Germany to exist. And we're going to find out this year how well that's going to go. And it doesn't look great because even if the Germans can get natural gas from somewhere else, it's going to cost 5 times as much. And that's still the end of the German model. Well, I've been accused of being a purveyor of doom porn, so it's hard for me to really argue with that. But every country is going to have to come up with their own solution. Every country basically has 3 paths to choose from. Number one, you kind of glom on to a country where this isn't a big deal. So in the case of Mexico, you obviously partner with the United States. The Japanese, for example, have decided that that's the way to go. And they cut a deal with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The Japanese are the only country to pull that off so far, and they are now part of the inner circle of the American strategic network. Second, you can find a way to go it alone. Maybe you don't need the allies. Maybe what you need is close and you can do kind of a neo-imperial system. I can see the French doing this. I can see the Turks doing this. Option 3 is you just figure out how to go without. And that means a starkly lower standard of living and probably significant changes, not just to your economic system, but your political system. Britain undoubtedly is going to go for some combination of 1 and 2. If Britain had figured out how to handle Brexit by this point, they could now be having the conversation about what's next, but we are still honestly back at square 2 on the Brexit talks. Well, I think you and I are in broad agreement on that from a personal point of view. But I think if we're being honest with ourselves, the economic explosions that some of these technologies have generated is robust. And if you were to suddenly do without the technological revolution, the world writ large, or the countries where that was the decision, or the decision being forced upon them, would be in a significantly worse position in a number of economic sectors. Now, remember, while this can be really annoying in many ways, it does allow some productivity gains that are quite impressive. And if you do without that, that's fine, you can, but you're looking at starkly lower economic growth and probably at a minimum a mild depression as we adjust. And for a lot of the world, that is going to be their future. Something that we think of as ubiquitous now, semiconductors, are actually the process of a relatively complicated manufacturing system that require inputs from half a world away. There is not a country on the planet with a fab facility that has the materials necessary to produce everything locally. Now, the United States does better than most because the US broadly has access to the Western Hemisphere, but even we have some serious holes in that supply chain. So I can see a lot of semiconductors just going away for a while until this all shakes out. And from the point that a finished fab facility starts production, to you getting the first intermediate products that can then be folded into other things, that's typically a year. So, what do you want to go analog? Is that your car? Is that passenger jets? Is that your personal communications? Is that your home appliances? I mean, we're going to have to make these decisions.
Canada has gone from being a partner integrated into the American system to a direct competitor. And that shift is now reflected in American economic policy. Now, if you can't get your birth rate back up, eventually you age into something like Japan. How do you run a first world economy without a workforce? You automate. They're the world leader in robotics because they have to be. Now, a funny thing about robots, they don't vote yet, so it doesn't matter where you put them. So Japan has become the world leader, not in outsourcing or in resourcing, but instead in something called de-sourcing. They've picked up huge chunks of their industrial plant, dropped it into other countries with better demographic structures so they can get closer to end markets and get on the safer side of currency risk and political risk and supply chain risk. Build where you sell. Toyota's 4 largest facilities in the world aren't anywhere near Japan. They're in Kentucky and Texas. Now here's the United States. We're kind of in the middle. We're kind of a chimney. There's 2 big groups we need to talk about. First, we've got the baby boomers. They are the largest generation as a percentage of the American population in this country's history. And they are all right on the verge of retirement. That changes our capital structure. Think about how you've invested in your life. When you're 35, you put a small sliver of a small income away. Not a lot of capital there. But when you're 55, you put a big fat wedge of a much larger income. And when you're 64 3/4, you shove every possible dime you can into those retirement accounts. As you age, you provide more capital on easier terms to more borrowers. And as a country, we are on the very urge of the boomers' mass retirement. Capital has never been this cheap. It's never been this easy to get. This is the tech boom right here. But in 3 years, the majority of the American boomer class will have moved into retirement. The velocity of capital won't stop. It'll reverse. The cost of capital will at least quadruple, which means the capital conditions that we've been used to for the last decade, almost over. If whatever you're doing takes a lot of cheap capital, get it done quick. Next generation, the millennials. Now, I normally like to spend about 45 minutes of every presentation talking about why the millennials are wastes of skin, but we don't have that kind of time today. So instead, we're going to go through all the reasons that we should all be grateful that the millennials are here. For you Xers and boomers out there, don't worry, this won't take long. There's really only 3 reasons. So, 1, consumption. All those juice bar memberships, all those bedazzled flip-flops, and all those constriction jeans, and all those goddamn scooters, they add up. Millennial consumption has kept the United States out of recession since 2009. We would have had 2 recessions since then without them. That's fantastic. And they're young enough, and there's enough of them, we probably have another 4 years of this consumption pulse. That's great. Second, if you fast forward to the year 2030, when the millennials are in charge, they will fill out the tax-paying class in a way that Gen X, my generation, never could. So there is a light at the end of the fiscal tunnel. It is not a train, it's a millennial. Whether that makes you want to jump for joy or cry in the corner, entirely up to you. Third, we think of the millennials in this country as the end-all and the be-all, but in reality, they're all alone in the night. Almost everybody else in the world has some version of the Japan or Canada problem. And if you look at the combined demography of the rich world without the Americans in it, it's a retirement community. The degree of capital collapse that is just around the corner is monumental. And as important as that is, what this means is the global order was going to end anyway, regardless of what the Americans did, because consumption-led growth on this planet is about to become impossible. Quick walk around the world. People's Republic of China. 30 years after the one-child policy, they've run out of 25-year-olds, because that is how math works. South Korea, aging even faster. What about developing Asia? Here's Thailand, only marginally better. If there's one country that can't have an open, honest conversation about population policy, that would be Germany. And if there was one country that we were convinced, that we just knew in our bones had cracked the code on how to have a lot of kids, that would be Italy, but apparently we were all wrong. Russia. Even if you believe Russian statistics, this is a terminal demography. They just made up 8 million children aged 10 and under in the last 18 months. Go fig. Oh, there we go. Brazil, country of the future. They're going to save us all, right? Yeah, look at the top left of that. This is Brazil 30 years ago. Here's Brazil today. They are aging at 6 times the American rate. They are becoming old long before they will become rich. And the average American will be younger than the average Brazilian by the year 2042. The average American became younger than the average American, the average American became younger than the average Chinese 2 years ago. Folks, there's only 2 countries on this planet that have a sustainable demography outside of the United States. And while the French can handle the catering and the Kiwis can man the bar, a global order that does not make. This was all going to end anyway. And if you remove the Americans from the equation, if you let the chips fall where they may, you get a series of brushfire wars as various countries, whether out of desperation or opportunity, feel compelled to take matters into their own hands. These are the zones that are likely to see the greatest exchanges of ammo. For those of you who know your history, you'll recognize that these are the parts of the world that historically have suffered the greatest conflicts. It's because it's where the world's geopolitical tectonic plates clash together. For those of you who know your economic history, you'll recognize these zones as the places that have seen the greatest economic growth over the last 70 years. That's because of the order, because the Americans forced everyone to be on the same side and outlawed war. It was base effect. And now it all goes into screaming reverse. The guy who is kind of midwifing this process is Robert Lighthizer. He's the U.S. trade representative. His job is to negotiate all the trade deals the U.S. has. Now, this is not his first stint in government. He used to work for the Reagan team back during the Cold War. Quick war story. If you go back to the early 1980s, the Cold War was running hot and heavy. We had a nuclear scare over Berlin in 1983. And the Reagan team saw that some of the allies were doing things like currency manipulation that we really didn't appreciate, but we really needed the allies lined up shoulder to shoulder, so Team Reagan turned a blind eye. But fast forward to 1985, and the Cold War was cooling off. Britain. Brexit has not gone well. It's going to be a hard Brexit with no deal. Now, in my opinion, this was always where it was going to go. With the European Union, you've got 27 states that all have veto power. There's no way you can make everybody happy considering all the issues that are in play, especially since some countries want to punish Britain. That's nothing compared to what's coming. Because the only way that Britain can avoid a hard depression, forget recession, that's now baked in. A depression is to get a free trade deal with the United States as quickly as possible. And Lighthizer knows this, and Lighthizer has explained this to Donald Trump. Quick war story, literally. You guys remember World War I? I mean, not personally, obviously, but we had a bunch of destroyers that by the technology of the day were really, really crappy. A lot of them started leaking in dry dock, which shouldn't be technically possible, but it happened anyway. At the end of the war, we scrapped a few of them in order to get parts to keep the rest going, but even then it didn't work very well, so we ended up mothballing about 44 of them. Come World War II and the Berlin blitzes, and the Brits were on the ropes. And they came to Washington and say, look, we need whatever help you can get. We realize you're not going to get in the fight, but what sort of ships can we have? We're like, well, you remember those ships that all of your sailors made fun of? You can have those. And the Brits were, oh, thank you very much, thank God. And the Americans were like, yeah, it will just cost you every single naval base you have in our hemisphere. Rude. That's the sort of deal that the Britons are going to get on an FTA with the United States. Something that will lock them into strategic subservience for at least the next half century. When Merkel showed up at the White House for the first time, she thought all she needed to do was explain the situation to Trump. So she came with a history lesson. She said, Mr. Trump, Germany is in the most geostrategically difficult place in the world. We're in the northern European plain. People can march on us from all directions. We have 8 major powers right on our borders. The only way we have ever discovered that Germany can be successful and safe and rich is to be better. Better financing, better infrastructure, better educational system, stronger labor force, stronger industrial base. But you take anything as efficient as Germany and you make it as big as Germany, and its very existence is perceived by everyone around it to be a mortal threat. So European history is this tragic pendulum that swings between periods of German strength, which foments a Europe-wide rebellion against us that tears us down in a cataclysmic war and makes Europe shattered and turns Central Europe into a shatter belt that sucks everybody in. Mr. President, the only way we Europeans have ever found of a way of stopping that pendulum is to bring in an external security guarantor who changes the rules of the game, who outlaws war, who puts us all on the same side. Mr. President, that's the United States, that's NATO, that's you. Do you realize if you do what you say you're going to do, that that's not just the end of the European Union and the end of NATO, that's the end of Germany itself? His response? Well, I do now. She didn't come offering anything. She didn't understand the transactional nature of American foreign policy now. She just wanted Trump to continue what the Americans have been doing for the last 70 years. So on her way out the door, Donald Trump gave her a parting gift. A bill for services rendered.
for defending Germany since 1946. For all intents and purposes, the American-German, the American-European, the American-NATO relationship ended over a year ago. And the institution is just on autopilot right now with absolutely no support. That just leaves Xi. I mean, you get a trade deal with South Korea, with the NAFTA countries, with Britain and Japan, that's already over half of the American trade portfolio. Remember, we're not a trading country, which means Xi has nowhere to go. His country is absolutely dependent upon external demand for their manufacturers, on external support for their materials and their energy, and on freedom of the seas to make everything go both ways. China cannot survive in a world of anything other than a global order. And so they're preparing for lockdown. And that's the environment that bilateral relations are right now. The question today isn't whether or not the Trump administration is going to play absolute to the end hardball with the Chinese. The question is whether or not these trade talks are anything other than a cover, with the goal being the absolute destruction of China as a unified nation state. Because that wouldn't be hard. All right. You can't have me here the day after the elections without me talking about politics a little bit. So let's start with what's going on with the Trump administration's thinking. Now, this is how a lot of supporters of Trump seem to think that he thinks of the world. Multidimensional chess. He's just on a whole nother level, a whole nother layer from the rest of us. Well, really, it's probably more like this. Now, if the game you're playing is one that you don't care about, then kicking over the board is not necessarily a bad strategy. Keep that in mind. The rules of the last 70 years no longer apply to the United States. And so if we kick over this ally or that ally, not a big deal. Now, whether or not Trump fully understands that is an entirely separate topic. But he's getting a lot of things right by random if he doesn't have some degree of underlying understanding. Okay. This is how the Democrats see the world. The diversity alliance. In the middle, the green, those are the white folks. The next layer out are Hispanics. The diversity alliance concept is that the United States is getting younger and more ethnically diverse. Therefore, the Democrats are the natural governing party of the United States, and all they have to do is sit back and let demographics run their course. Well, folks, the Democrats have never been very good at math. This demography only exists in this form in California. So yes, that strategy can work here. And yes, you will be dealing with that until the sun explodes. But that is not where the nation is going. The most demographically diverse state is not California, it's New Mexico. Hawaii's second, and Texas is third. And if there's one word that you would use to describe Texas, it is not blue. Fun fact, second generation Hispanics are stronger social conservatives than evangelicals. So the Democratic strategy of recruiting illegal immigrants and young voters is recruiting people for this election cycle that cannot vote, but will vote Republican the next cycle. That's a really stupid strategy. But it has been the Democratic strategy now for 40 freaking years. Lo and behold, they are down 1,000 seats across the various elected officials of the state legislature or above. In this blue wave we just had, you know how many they picked up? 40. That's not a recovery. That is the lowest recovery in a midterm election of any oppositional party in American history. And that after the biggest push in terms of funding and celebrity endorsements that we have ever seen in this country. That is a dead cat bounce, nothing more. It gets worse. Here's Georgia. That's kind of broadly representative of the South. Still red. Here's the greater Midwest. Very white. And there's the Northeast. You notice how it's aging? As the baby boomers move into retirement, they're not just shifting from left to right, they're shifting to right populist of the Ted Cruz variety. So the Democratic strategy in its current form is a disaster in waiting. Of the 15 predictions of a blue wave in the last 30 years, we've only had blue progress on 3 of them. That's not a hiccup. That's the path that strategy leads to. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily the Republicans are in good shape. Now, for those of you who were here last time, I showed you this chart. This kind of breaks down the factions in the various parts of the American political community. And I also showed you this. This is how we actually ended up in 2016. The two parties, for the moment, are offline. They're reshuffling. This happens. It's normal. It's even healthy. Technology evolves. The balance of power among the states shifts. Demography changes. The parties shift with it on a delay of 5 to 10 years.
বিড়াল তারপরে কয়েকদিন মধ্যে আবার বাবা ছেলে মারা গেছে
আব্বু আব্বু আব্বু
Well, something to keep in mind that of the first world countries, we have the lowest regulatory burden, bar none. And one of the advantages of being a federal system is you've got 50 different sets of policies, and you can mix and match and try different things. And so all 50 states are not going to double their industrial plant. No.
Just Texas.
Texas is probably going to triple. Northern Mexico is probably going to triple. Here, it's going to be a really squishy figure because so much of the tech sector is also in services, so it's kind of a hard measure. But different states are going to be able to take care of this at different angles. And if you're kind of looking for like the one thing to watch to determine if we can even try this, assuming the green transition stops today, assuming all we do is build out the industrial plant in order to produce our own manufactured goods, we need to increase electricity production in the United States by 50%. And if your community cannot get the extra power, then it's really hard for you to get into manufacturing. So there's going to be a lot of lead time here. I phrased that wrong. There's going to be a lot of leading indicators that tell us who is going to try to grab an outsized chunk of this. When we think of globalization, we usually think of transport and manufacturing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but every sector we have is globalized. And if you look at the original green revolution, lowercase g, the agricultural revolution of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was about bringing industrial inputs to lands that hadn't had them before, places that could not be major agricultural producers without synthetic fertilizers. The biggest beneficiary from that is Brazil. And the biggest provider of those things is Russia. And the biggest processor of these things is China. So it doesn't take any more than a mild case of deglobalization to break global agriculture in its current form. And there's no way you do that without losing 1 billion people. So the countries that are able to have an indigenous supply system for agriculture are largely exempt. The places that were producing food before 1950 because they had good land and good weather are largely exempt. And the US is at the top of the list in both of those. We only import about 10% of our nitrogen fertilizer, only about 10% of our phosphate, and most of that comes from within the hemisphere. We do import 90% of our potash, but almost all of that comes from Canada. So, they are good for something. But those numbers are almost entirely flipped when you're looking at Australia or Brazil. So it's easy to massively increase your electricity production and then double the size of your industrial plant. That's the low-hanging fruit in the change that's coming. Even if you're able to build out the replacement for the fertilizer and the transport system, you've still missed a half a dozen harvests. And that means you've lost a lot of people already. Fun little story. During the first month of the Ukraine war, when Putin was the one making all the nuclear threats personally, the US ambassador was dispatched. And he basically said, I'm going to not tell you anything you don't know here. I'm just going to shine a light on what you do know from a different angle. It's like, you remember back 2 months ago when the day you decided when the war was going to start, what day it was going to be on, you were in that bunker under the Kremlin that was the safe in the safe in the safe. No one was taking notes because you didn't want anything to leak out. There no possibility of electronic eavesdropping. And you remember how an hour after you left that bunker, we shared the full minutes of that meeting with the media? That was our way of telling you that we know exactly where you are at any moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen that come back are going to go absolutely anywhere but directly up your ass, you're out of your mind. So stop it. And he did. Now it's all his flunkies making the threats. The point is that Russia despite his flaws, Putin, despite his flaws, he has an inner circle. He has people he trusts. He has people that he discusses things with. And so you can tap his phones, you can hack his emails, you can get an idea of what's going on within the Kremlin. You can't do that in Beijing because Xi speaks with no one. Now, 5 years ago, I knew for certain that the understanding of the Politburo was that a war for Taiwan, even if they could capture the place easily, wasn't going to solve anything for them. In fact, it would be the end of China's industrial experience because China imports 80% of its energy and 80% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. So you put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and it all shuts down. And you have a post-industrial collapse complete with a famine in under 6 months that within a couple of years probably kills half the population. They knew that. I don't know if they know that anymore. No one's certainly going to remind Xi of it. And so you've got this leader who is imbibing almost nothing but his own propaganda. The official strategic military plan for the PLA now, the People's Liberation Army, is Xi Jinping economic thought. He wrote a treatise on the role of military in society, and they now study that instead of doing proper wargaming. And so I can't tell you that there's going to be a kinder outcome here that's more based on compromise and reality, because Xi has made sure that he's not part of that reality. And that makes it unpredictable, but I don't think there's a lot of hope for kind of a nuanced negotiation here. You guys remember when Blinken went out in the aftermath of the balloon fiasco? He went so he'd have a conversation with the foreign minister about how far up the information blackout went, and he found out that the foreign minister hadn't spoken to Xi in 4 months. This isn't a country anymore. This is just a march. There's not an institution, there's a person. And Biden, from a foreign military strategic point of view, I think is kind of a B-rate president, which is the best we've had. Not Trump, not W, not Obama, not Clinton. Yeah, since Herbert Walker Bush. Definitely the best on security issues since Herbert Walker Bush. Admittedly, it's a low bar. And he's clearly losing his mind. Gives you an idea of how low the bar is. One of the beautiful things about having a president that's older than the pyramids is that he remembers the pyramids. He's seen the long run of history, and he's definitely a subscriber to the age-old American doctrine that our system is so stable that all we have to do is outweight them. And that's a correct assessment. Doesn't mean that we can't have better policy on a day-to-day basis. Definitely not saying that. On an economic point of view, oh my God. Yeah, he's definitely in the bottom third. But so were the last 5. So, it's, again, low bar. Politically, what we are going through right now is every generation or two, the factions that make up our parties move around. It's a feature of our electoral laws. And eventually some jump ship, some switch sides. The factions rise and fall in power within the coalitions. And at the end of the process, you get 2 fundamentally new parties. This is the 6th time we've done this, and we are right in the middle of it right now. So the business community and the national security community have been kicked out of the Republican coalition, and the unions have left the Democratic coalition. And so if you're wondering why economic policy in Biden and Trump eras just makes no sense, that's because it makes no sense. Because the people who have been responsible for making economic policy in this country for the last 180 years, for the first time in 180 years, aren't even in the room. They're not allowed in the room. And you've got MAGA who thinks that the business community is part of the problem. And then you've got the Greens on the other side who want to punish the business community. And until such time as the unions or the business community or both end up in one or the other coalitions, this is just where we are. So this is definitely one of those times where, thank God, we're a federal system where the state and the local governments are responsible for most of the policies that affect us on a daily basis.